3, 2, 1, action. Welcome to Hóčhoka podcast.
How, Mataki. Welcome to Hóčhoka at the center of St. Joseph's Indian School's campus. I am your host, Scott Wooster. Today, in our third conversation with Black Elk expert Dr. Damian Costello, we explore how Black Elk's faith helped him to address the new world he faced so that, in the words of Black Elk, the people may live. So, in our first conversation, you emphasized that Black Elk actually encountered Christianity long before the reservation church system. And a lot of his Lakota Catholic faith was in place before he was even baptized. So why is that important?
That's really important, I think, for a number of reasons. Today, we're still dealing with the fallout from the residential school situation, and the fact that Christian faith was part of the government's tool to reprogram Native peoples. It was imposed from the outside in a lot of cases, and for a lot of people feels very artificial, right? And understandably, there's a feeling that if you acquiesce to that and participate in it, if you became Christian, you're selling out on some level. And we want to be authentic and address that question. We don't want anybody's faith or how they understand themselves to be inauthentic or to be a sellout. And so if we look at Black Elk's faith, this is a reflection of not just his own sort of spiritual yearnings, but the product of a way to address the problems that he was facing. That this spiritual journey he was on and the decisions he made and the different sort of practices that he participated in helped him to address that situation, helped him to survive so that so that people may live, right? Mm-hmm. Is the great phrase that he uses over and over again and is part of Lakota tradition. And so it's important because his faith represents survival, not a sort of sellout to the outside.
Right. I like that. You make the argument, I believe, that there was not the contradiction between Lakota and faith and Christianity that a lot of people experience today. Can you talk a little more about that, the differences between how that would have looked back then and how it would look now?
Well, one thing you hear a lot today is people will say, those who practice both ways, who say, I'm Lakota, I'm Christian, or I'm Catholic, I can pray with the pipe just as well I can pray in church or with a rosary, right? That there's a deep congruency between those spiritualities. And so that the love that Black Elk discovered in Europe, right, with that quote of 1 Corinthians 13, we see that in the Lakota way too, right? It may look a little bit different, but this is a reflection of different paths to sort of the same destination. You'll hear a lot. So that there's not any sort of big differences or contradictions between those paths. They just may look a little bit different.
Right. And we talked just for a moment off camera too about this, that he came back and his big revelation was love is kind of the key to both of those things. And is for myself, as a guy who grew up Catholic and has been exposed to much of Lakota faith or spirituality here at the school over the last 28 years, that was always the draw for me, was the love and the hope and that kind of thing. So I think that really resonates what Nicholas Black Elk came back and said. It's interesting that you note that the first thing that he basically said when he came back or wrote about was Corinthians and the greatest of these and that type of thing. So, yeah.
And, if we're not doing that in our spiritual ways, what are we doing? Right? Are we just sin counting? Are we, following rules? That can be important, but it's got to be about something very deep.
Right.
And that's what people who practice both would say. But I think also, as we go forward, is to start asking the question, all right, they're very similar and congruent, and they feed that sort of deep well. What are they doing differently, right? They're very different. You do very different things in the Lakota and Catholic way. And so one of the questions that I've been trying to tease out when I look at Black Elk and then just the Catholic way and Lakota way is, let's try and get a handle on how they're different, because they may complement each other to create something bigger than what we had before. And so if we go back to Black Elk's life and we ask the question, why is he doing the things that he's doing? Okay, so why does he encounter Christianity in the context that he does, and why is it important? And we talked briefly about how before contact, before Black Elk went overseas, before the reservation, you had a very small community of people who were just like you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there were differences, competitions, you had feuds, you had all kinds of things you dealt with. But usually the name for a tribal people is the people, right? So the Navajo, their name is Dene, which means the people.
Yeah.
And the implication is, well, I'm not so sure about those others outside.
Right.
Right?
Right.
They can become human by being adopted into our people, right? There's a little bit more distance and a little more uncertainty about how you interact with them.
Right.
Well, suddenly Black Elk and all these other Native people are thrown into this vastly bigger world. All of a sudden, millions of people that live a lifestyle that's totally foreign to anything they've ever known. And they're also having the experience of deep connection with them. They're falling in love. They're having interesting conversations. There are people who are coming up to them and genuinely want to know about their way of life. They were celebrities. And the Catholic, the Christian spirituality, I think, gave a new way to understand that situation that Lakota spirituality didn't have. And that's not because there was anything wrong with it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just based on a people who lived by themselves on the open plains and helped them to thrive doing that. So this was an added component to love that people outside of that group, even if they may be part of a people who are oppressing you or doing bad things, are worthy of love, and that there's this possibility of their redemption too. So one way to put it is to say this was a way that helped Native people to participate in global society from a spiritual perspective, to not just see it as tragedy. Because it would be very easy to get bitter. It would be very easy to write off the outside world and say, they're just awful, the white devil, right?
Right, right.
Black Elk and most people didn't want to stay there.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so he went from being scorned to celebrated. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes. And resisting the temptation to scorn the outside world,
right,
and finding the possibility of celebrating the outside world. You can also flip that around, right? Okay, there's an aspect of Christianity that is new in Lakota context. Well, what would be new from Lakota context for Christianity? Like, for example, what does the Sundance do that Christianity doesn't do? And you're familiar with Sundance, right? It's about the buffalo. Historically, that was a ceremony in which you made relatives with the buffalo. That's how you call the buffalo, to give their lives so that the people may live. And so you gave of your own flesh that the Buffalo Nation would give its flesh. So if you think in the Catholic context, we have some of that, like we use bread and wine, that's food. But we don't understand ourselves making relatives with wheat or grapes, right?
Right.
And our society, we're trying to figure how do we have better relationship with our food, right? How do we grow healthier food? How do we grow food that doesn't destroy our land? How do we have a connection with our food? That's what the Sundance is about. And so that's a gap in our spirituality as Catholic people, as Western people, modern people. We don't have anything to feed us in that way. And so the Sundance and other practices of Native peoples show us how we can start thinking about making relatives with the beings that sustain us.
Right. And I'm thinking Mitakuye Oyasin, as you're saying this, we're all relatives. And you look at a typical, correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of the Christian worldview of dominion over the animals and the land and those types of things, whereas the Sundance, the Lakota spirituality would be about that melding and bringing all that together. Mitakuye Oyasin.
One way I like to talk about it with my students is, in the Christian way, the things that we can do well, we don't always do it well, but it helps us think about that vertical relationship between God or the spirits and humanity. And it helps us with that horizontal relationship with other human beings. Those diagonal ones, like with the four-leggeds and the winged nations and all the different beings, the plant nations, we don't have a spiritual relationship with them, right? And so Native spirituality gives us those diagonal relationships and sort of fills in those gaps. And I think Black Elk, he does a great way of summarizing this in his book, The Sacred Pipe, what he wrote 2 years before his death. And so in the very beginning, he says, these white people came, they told us about Jesus and how he was going to bring peace to the earth and among human beings. And I believe that. It's almost kind of a throwaway line. If you didn't know he was like deeply, deeply Catholic, you would just think, oh, he's just sort of placating his readers. But I think that's a very sincere line. He says, but you and our children, Lakota children, need to know these ways, because it doesn't just bring peace between human beings, it brings peace between human beings and the earth. And that's something that I think we've demonstrated in very drastic terms and we need to work on.
Right. So Damian, how can Lakota practices and teachings draw out new meaning in Catholic practices and teachings?
It's one of the, I think, most fascinating things about this conversation, and maybe you've witnessed this in your own journey and your work here at St. Joseph's, is that you put these two things together and you're going to start seeing new things about practices that you thought you knew all about decades ago. So like one example is the rosary. Like if someone were to come to me 5-10 years ago and said, Damian, what do you think about the rosary? And I would have said, well, that's about the, whitest American prayer practice you could possibly imagine, right? But then I started looking to see what the Lakota thought about the rosary. And very immediately, that was one of the first things that attracted people to the black robes and their way of prayer. So, we talked about Father de Smet and how he gifted his rosary to Sitting Bull. And that was very common. He ran out of rosaries very, very quickly when he would go on his journeys. People love the rosaries because Native peoples love beads. I mean, beads are so important for our Native culture. Lewis and Clark paid their journey across the continent with just beads. And so the beads with a prayer that went with it, Native people understood. They had already, oral cultures have all kinds of physical objects to help them remember things, so like the winter count, right? It's a memory aid, so that with a little picture, you can tell a whole story about a year. And so they very naturally understood, you count out the beads and they have different stories, teachings that go with the beads. It was a very easy way of passing along the sort of essence of the Catholic way of life. Well, what's interesting is the origin story that Catholics tell about the rosary is very Lakota. St. Dominic, who was, I believe, in the 1100s, maybe early 1200s, he was a preacher. He wanted to go fight the heretics, preaching in France, Albigensians, and he was having no effect for a couple years. And he was known as a good preacher, and he he reached the end of the line. He said, "This isn't working. I don't know what to do." And he went on a hamblecha. He went on a vision quest. He didn't use that term, but he went into the wilderness for 3 days where he fasted and prayed. That's what a vision quest is. And in that, at the end of that, he got a vision from the Blessed Mother that said, "Here, this is a new way of prayer that I'm gifting to you," which we know all good vision quests end with that gift of power, that what you were seeking, the spirits hear you and answer. And so, one thing that Catholics love to do is we run around and we say, "Oh, you nice Lakota person, or you nice Buddhist, you're so nice that we'll call you an anonymous Catholic, right? You're so good that you kind of understand the goodness that we have, you just don't realize it." Well, if you took that perspective, an elder, a Lakota elder could say, "Well, yeah, St. Dominic, he was kind of an anonymous Lakota because he followed that Lakota way." It became a very important prayer for Lakota people, very important for funerals, very important that as a community you would say that. So Pete Ketches, I don't know if you've ever heard, famous medicine man, right? This great story one of the Jesuits told. He showed up at a funeral in Calico, I believe it was. It was an Episcopal church. He showed up, he had been a catechist like Black Elk. He went back to his traditional ways, but he showed up, he said, "Is anyone going to say the rosary for this person that had died?" And no one was. He says, "All right, well, I'll lead it." And so here's Pete Ketches, who's really the most prominent figure in revitalizing the Sundance in Pine Ridge, saying the rosary.
Right.
Black Elk and a lot of the catechists, the rosary was very important for praying with the sick. They prayed it as a family before going to bed. And then there's this great little nugget about his life. When he was an elder, he would walk to church, say the rosary with one of his friends. And they remembered that he wouldn't use distance, like miles or time for how far something away was. He would say, "Oh, that's like 2 rosaries." And I love pairing this with that image of him walking, saying the rosary with that teaching that he gives. May every step on Mother Earth be as a prayer, right? So that he's walking his prayers on the earth, which he says, that's what our Lakota way does. It makes peace with the earth. And he's saying the rosary, bringing it all together into sort of one seamless way.
I like that.
Yeah.
Does that work the other way around? Do Catholic practices and teachings tend to draw out new meaning in Lakota practices and teachings?
I think there's definitely evidence of that. I think both in the record with Black Elk and people of his generations, and then in my own personal experience, Black Elk left us a record of the Sundance in his book, The Sacred Pipe. But he wasn't the first to do that. He was sort of a half generation behind the very first people who are leaving accounts of the Sundance. And so from what we can reconstruct, the Sundance was different from what we have today in that it was more, the vow was taken more for personal power, particularly in war or hunting. In Black Elk's account, he tells it in very, very much like the Passion narratives in the Gospel, in that the purpose of the Sundance is that so the people may live. He takes out the emphasis on war and sort of personal glory that, let's be honest, some Sundancers are into that, and shifts it to the survival of the people as the whole. It's not to say that that wasn't there beforehand, in that the Catholic spirituality introduced something new, but for Black Elk, he saw this as in service of the entire people and a reflection of what Jesus did on the cross. And I don't know if your experience, you've heard this, but I know the Sundances I've been around, you always hear people say, someone will say, Jesus was the first Sundancer. And I can, even people who are not Christian would talk about, Jesus being the first Sundancer. So there's this very clear connection to that early generation, but that also drew out sort of new emphasis on the people as a whole.
Right.
Yeah.
I always think about what a gift that is, that we have that, the Native American Freedom of Religion Act 1978. Before that point, they could not do that. They could not, on their basically their home, their native land, were not able to express themselves in prayer in that way. And now they can do that. I'm here at a residential school in 2021, where I think by and large, there are no hindrances to our children being able to choose their own spiritual path. What do you think about that?
I think that would make Black Elk very happy.
Mm-hmm.
I think his life demonstrated that willingness to experiment and to search for different ways to find power for different situations. And he understood that this isn't ultimately a matter of the mind, right? And I think that's one really powerful part of Native spirituality. It's something you do first and foremost, that you put into practice. It's a way of life that you live, that you walk. And so his image of the sacred red road, of walking, right? I think a lot of us modern people get very confused, like, oh, we've got to figure out the right ideas, and then our spiritual life will be okay, or we'll be doing right things. And it's actually, for people like Black Elk, and it sounds like for the children here at St. Joseph's, is you put these things into practice so that you can live in a good way and you experience those things, is that the spirits may come to you. And it's a continual process, and there are no ready answers. Like I think particularly in the Catholic world, have been all too ready to give to kids in school. And I think Black Elk, one thing about him as a person, despite this awful history that he experienced, was he was able to build bridges and connect with all kinds of people around him. He was able to overcome, at least at the personal level, these massive societal problems. And when I come to St. Joseph's, that's what I feel is happening here too, right? We have a big history. We got a lot of open questions. But on a personal level, we reach out, we connect with people, we put good things into practice so that we can try to live in a good way. And we don't know all the answers, but neither did Black Elk. To the end of his life, he would say, I hope I'm living my vision out. I don't know. But he walked in faith, and, that's the best we can do.
Absolutely. Damian, once again, thank you for joining us here in the Hóčhoka at the center of the St. Joseph's Indian School campus, where we talk about issues that are central to Native America today. Until next time, stay centered.